out of the shadows and into the rays of hope. These are the stories that define our nation. Stories of lives broken, lives ended, but also lives rebuilt. Now, giving light to what's happening in communities big and small in every corner of America. Veterans, Black mothers, abused children, burned out professionals, survivors of mass shootings, all with personal stories to share of mental health. This is America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here now, John Donvan.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for what we hope will be an informative and ultimately uplifting 2 hours. For years, we have heard talk of America's mental health crisis. We have talked about solutions, ranging from more funding to more help and access to that help. But what does all of that really mean? And for those being affected, what is their reality? We are about to find out. This is our reality. More than 4 in 10 high school students have experienced persistent sadness or loneliness over the past 12 months. More than half of young people say they have experienced emotional abuse by a parent or caregiver during the pandemic. Adults are struggling too. Adults aged 18 to 44 went from being considered least likely to have received treatment for mental health in 2019 to most likely in 2021. We have traveled the country, meeting the people that you will be hearing from in this program. Among our featured guests, Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy. And with us from Salt Lake City, Elizabeth Smart. She is standing by to join us 20 years after her abduction. But first, an introduction from reporter Bob Evans.
I want to again thank all of you for being here today.
It took me a while to recognize that I will never be who I was before all this happened. That will never happen. That person is gone.
And so Elizabeth Smart was left with the challenge of not just moving beyond what had happened to her, but actually making something good of it. The combined Elizabeth Smart and Malou Foundations empower individuals, communities, and survivors to confront sexual violence and exploitation, especially sex trafficking and online abuse.
And now I feel like the future is unlimited.
A lot of what they'll do together is education.
If you catch on fire, what do you do?
Stop, drop, and roll.
Stop, drop, and roll, exactly. When you're about to cross the street, what do you do?
You go both ways.
Both ways, exactly. But what do you do if someone discloses abuse to you? Exactly, nothing. And the sad truth is that about every 70 seconds in America, someone is sexually abused. Every 9 minutes, it's a child.
Resources include initiatives, the Smart Talks podcast, healing programs, and the We Believe You campaign every November.
I would hope that in another 20 years from now, that survivors aren't scared to speak out, that they aren't riddled with guilt and shame. I hope that as a community, as a nation, that, frankly, globally, I hope that we are a little bit more compassionate and a little bit more supportive.
Great good is coming of what happened 20 years ago, but it has not been without tremendous effort, primarily on Elizabeth's part, and all those who worked to bring her home.
I mean, I will never stop saying thank you to the people who have loved me and supported me and searched for me and supported my family. I will forever be grateful.
We are so honored to have survivor and advocate and wife and mother Elizabeth Smart here with us right now, and also advocate Clay Olson, founder and CEO of Impact Suite. The two of them are working together to launch a new self-care mental health app. And it's a pleasure to have both of you here. And Elizabeth, the audience just saw a little bit of a very compressed version of the story of the things that you went through. Literally 20 years ago, you were in captivity. And now you're here in this interview, you're doing a lot of public speaking. What's that journey been for you over those last 20 years?
It's something that I never imagined would be my story. That is certainly very true. And there's been a lot of ups and downs. There's been times where I've felt like this is really, really unfair. This should have never happened to me. I should never have been in this situation. But time has gone on, and I certainly am not sorry that it happened to me. I mean, that sounds like I'm okay with it, I would never wish it upon anyone, never wish it upon myself, but I also can look back and see where I've been and the opportunities that it has allowed me and the cause that it has given me to support and push for in my life, and for that I'm grateful.
Talk about that cause now. What is that?
So survivors, let me back up a little bit. When I first came home, I didn't know anyone who was a survivor. I never heard anyone say, I survived a rape, or I survived a kidnapping. I didn't know anybody. And so I felt like I was very much alone. I felt like there was nobody that I could turn to. And frankly, I didn't really want to, because I just didn't think anyone could understand what that was like. And
so you didn't want to because of, you didn't think you would find anybody to understand, or you didn't want to talk or think about it?
Probably a little bit of both. But just going into a stranger felt really intimidating to me, and it felt like, well, they weren't with me, and words can only describe so much. I mean, I could sit here and tell you how I felt or what it was like, but even that would just be a very black and white kind of picture. It wouldn't have depth or dimension or color or anything to it. So it felt like a very intimidating, scary thing to try to open myself up to that kind of vulnerability, to allow someone to understand what I'd been through. So I was very hesitant to speak out about it, and I was very hesitant to share my experiences and what I went through. But as I have moved forward in my life, I've felt that there is such a need for survivors. And honestly, we're all survivors of something. I mean, I don't know anybody who hasn't been through something. We're all survivors to some degree of something. And I think it is very important to share our stories, because then the other people who maybe haven't spoken out about it or haven't shared their stories yet realize that they're not alone, that there are other people out there who are doing the same thing or have been through the same things, and then they have a direction to go in if they do need help, if they do need support.
This all happened to you when you were a child, and now you're an adult. And is there a way specifically in which what happened to you as a child shapes who you are now as an adult, and especially as a parent? How many kids do you have now?
I have 3.
Congrats.
Thanks. Well, definitely. I mean, I go to the grocery store, and it's usually when I'm checking out, and my little boy starts pulling on my leg and saying he has to go to the toilet, and I say, well, can you just wait till we go home? He's like, no, I have to poop right now. I mean, honestly, didn't even know grocery stores had bathrooms till I had kids. And that's usually about the time that someone comes up to me and says, you're Elizabeth Smart, aren't you? You're the girl that was kidnapped, aren't you? So yeah, I mean, it definitely has affected my life, even to this day. As a parent, I mean, my kids certainly are there listening. And then I usually get asked by them, well, what happened, Mom? Why did they know you? Are you famous, Mom? I've gotten those awkward questions many times now.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say to your kids about that?
So the best piece of advice that I was given was that when your children start asking questions, no matter what it is, you should answer them, because at that point you control what is being said. If you don't answer or say, wait till they're older, they'll start asking other people or turning to the all-knowing Google and get their answers there. So I try to answer those questions as best I can at an age-appropriate level. My children are still quite young, so I don't go into deep, dark details about it. But I do talk about what overall happened, and I talk about that's why I always want them to be safe. That's why I don't leave them alone. That's why, I always need to know what they're doing.
And how much of the work that you do now actually focuses on children who are vulnerable?
So I feel like the work that I do now, I mean, it could focus on anyone.
Anybody.
Because there are survivors in every age group, in every generation. We're all going through something. I mean, I have a lot of parents reach out to me. Frankly, probably not as many as Clay does, but I do have a lot of parents reach out to me and say, how do I talk to my kids about this? What can I do? And I mean, I think actually that's why what Clay has been working on is so incredible, because even for me, where, I've been through this and I speak about this and I talk about it all the time, a lot of times I don't have great answers, and I don't know what to say. I mean, I've only been a parent for 7 years. That's how old my oldest is. That's not that long. I'm not an expert.
That's also a lifetime of experience in terms of parenting. But tell us, Clay, about the work that you're doing together.
So, we have been focusing on trying to develop and answer some of these questions for parents. Studies have shown that parents, almost all parents, are concerned about the digital safety of their children, the safety of their children, the behaviors that they're engaging in online. And yet, on average, parents are spending about 46 minutes throughout their entire child's childhood talking about digital safety or talking about online safety. So there's a huge gap between what parents are actually doing, and yet they have a high concern. So we want to help close that gap. So we're working on a project called RAISE, and parents can go and get educated and empowered to help them navigate the challenges of today's digital landscape.
And I want to talk about the mental health issue related to the digital landscape. And Clay, some of our research shows that the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in kids are ADHD, anxiety, behavior issues, and depression. But I want to focus on anxiety and depression because those diagnoses seem to be increasing. Do you have any insight as to why that is?
Oh yeah, we're seeing huge increases in this, and yet we're spending, unprecedented amounts of money, more money than we've ever spent on trying to prevent these challenges. We have more therapists per capita than any other time in human history, and yet these challenges continue to be on the rise. And what we are finding with regard to the mental health challenges that we're facing is that we need to think of this differently than we used to. We need to have a paradigm shift in the way that we talk and think about mental health. We need to be looking at the symptoms and the risk factors that are driving these behaviors to even exist, rather than just numbing those symptoms in the way that we do as a society. Well, I think some of the work that Dr. Alardi over at the University of Kansas is doing is fantastic.
Tell me about that.
So, he famously quoted, he said that, we were never designed as a society. We were never designed for the sedentary, indoor, sleep-deprived, screen-addicted, fast food-laden, frenetic pace of modern life. Mm-hmm. And there are consequences to the way that we live. There are consequences to these lifestyles that we have been so accustomed to. Mm-hmm. And they are having an implication or ramifications on our collective mental health and well-being. And so as we tune in to our lives and tune into the emotional pain that we're feeling, rather than just numbing them out or running from those, paying attention to what they could be teaching us and looking at the nutrition that we're engaging in, the exercise, the sunlight, the past trauma, the relationships, and looking at these lifestyle risk factors that might be contributing to these challenges.
Elizabeth, I think what Clay is talking about is something that a lot of parents are struggling with, is the often toxic impact of the digital, social, online world on self-esteem, depression, anxiety. And you have pointed out that the advice used to be, well, put the computer in a room where everybody's circulating. That doesn't work anymore because everybody has a little computer in their hand. How do your kids want or have phones, and how do you deal with it?
As I mentioned, my oldest is 7, so no, she doesn't have a phone yet.
But is she asking for one?
Oh, every birthday, every Christmas, she wants a phone. She wants some kind of watch. She wants some kind of technology she can carry with her. And I didn't have a cell phone until I was 16. It was like after I was rescued, and that was more because my parents were like, okay, you're going out in public without us. You need to have a cell phone. Mm-hmm. We need to know where you are at all times. And I have to admit, there is a side of me that throughout the day, I feel like it would give me peace of mind to know exactly where she is. I mean, she should only be at school or dance or at home. But even still, I can understand why parents would want to give that technology to their kids. It's almost like a peace of mind, knowing that you could get in touch with them or they could get in touch with you if they needed. But for me, I haven't, and I'm very hesitant to give her that because I want her to have a childhood, and I don't want her to go on social media and start comparing herself to other people. And what's even scarier, even than just maybe what you would call self-inflicted damage, though, is the portal that it opens up to the other people who can contact her. I do not want other people contacting her. I don't want predators seeking her out. And so for me, more than anything, I think that's why I
very real to you. Clay, what is the best piece of advice that you can give parents?
Well, I would say, kind of like what Elizabeth is saying, it is now when and not an if they will be reached out by a stranger online, and with oftentimes malintent. It is a reality of the world that they live in, and social media, all the research coming through is having detrimental effects, particularly on adolescents. So luckily, there are alternatives to these. Back in the day, it was kind of an all or nothing approach. You had to give them a cell phone that unlocked all of these challenges. Today, there are alternatives, phones that are more locked down. There are a lot of great companies out there addressing these challenges. And again, so the resource that we're providing, called RAISE, helps parents navigate that and answer some of these questions around how to protect their kids against online predators, confronting cyberbullying, navigating inappropriate content, managing screen time balance, and nurturing parent-child relationships in that bond.
A lot useful there. I want to thank both of you for joining us in the conversation. It's been really, really helpful. And when we come back, we expand our focus to how to protect our kids. The therapist in Buffalo, New York, will detail the unique struggle of Black teenagers. That's coming up next on America's Breakdown, a national conversation.
Over 150,000 students that lost a parent or primary caregiver, they're coming back to our classrooms. They're going to need help. So if we don't fundamentally rethink the role of mental health supports in our schools, we're going to be putting Band-Aids on a bigger issue.
In the Black community, and mine in particular, it was something we looked at as if it wasn't real. You know, depression is something that if you're strong enough, you can just get past.
Since the start of the pandemic, it has become increasingly true that our kids are not all right. Unfortunately, that is especially true for Black and Asian teens. Over 1/3 of youth in the U.S. reported they experienced racism at some point during their lifetime. 1/3. The highest levels are among Asian and Black students. We want to bring you some perspective on this difficult situation faced by so many kids of color. And this is the story of one mother in Buffalo, Reverend Denise Walden Glenn.
My name is Reverend Denise Walden Glenn. I am 42 years old and I live in Buffalo, New York. I am blessed to have 13 children total, ranging from 26 years old to 13 years old.
Breaking news out of Buffalo, New York, where authorities say at least 10 people are dead after a mass shooting at a supermarket.
I looked at my phone and saw my husband's photo. So I answered the phone and he told me, he said, something terrible is happening. And a lot of people are trying to call you. And I had missed, several calls. And so I called her and she said, you need to get to TOPS right now. There's a shooting happening out there. May 14th brought up a lot of questions for my children. I think it brought up a lot of questions for a lot of us. Right after it happened, in all honesty, I didn't know how to answer any of the questions. My kids wanted to know why. But I found myself like any sudden movement, any out of the ordinary noises, I was flinching. I was just kind of jumpy. I'm definitely on edge. My family and I have safety plans all the time. Like, this has now become our norm. Mental health and wellness is something that I'm very passionate about. It means a lot to me. I am a practitioner and a trainer of restorative practices. And so that was something that very soon after the shooting, we were very aware, like, we needed to have that in place. So yes, my family is receiving mental health services, and not just necessarily what we see as traditional therapy, but a lot of non-traditional mental health services, like art therapy, music therapy, movement therapy, and things that, yes, it helps us learn to deal with our anxiety, our breathing, but also just gives us joy. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to have the emotions that you have. And there's nothing wrong with needing help and needing community and needing support. We as human beings were created that way. We are taught to be strong and resilient, and that we should have it within our own know-with-all to get through everything. But that is a myth. That is not true. We have to walk in our own liberation, our own freedom, which starts in our mind and in our heart, and realizing that we have the ability to be part of creating what we want to see in our communities and our lives. And I'm honored to walk in it every day.
The story of Reverend Denise Walden Glenn. And that is just the start of the conversation we have on tap for you. Here are more of the people standing by to join us. They include a would-be school shooter and a woman who survived the Las Vegas massacre here together. But first, veterans committing suicide. You'll hear from a former Army medic who has overcome crippling PTSD. How did he do it? And an undersecretary at the Department of Veterans Affairs bringing us surprising new information that is already saving lives.
It was one night when I was sitting down on the couch with my wife and our dog. They were asleep. I was able to look at them and take them in for who they were and what was right in front of me.
This is America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here again, John Donvan.
Every year, up to 1 in 5 American veterans experiences PTSD. That is a staggering statistic, and it impacts countless lives. Among those lives is a former Army combat medic named Sergio Alfaro. The 39-year-old veteran of the Iraq War struggled for years upon his return. He was consumed by the horrors of what he saw on the battlefield. His story is not only heartbreaking, but it is also inspirational because he overcame his trauma.
My name is Sergio Alfaro. I am 39 years old. I'm a veteran. I served as an Army medic. I was with the 116th Mechanized Infantry, Ramadi, Iraq, from 2003 to 2004. There's faces that I'll never forget. It's something that I see time and time again in my head, regardless of whatever it is I'm doing. It feels like there's always a face that sits there in my mind, in the background, kind of looking at me, watching me. This face is of an Iraqi policeman. He was somebody who was shot through the abdomen. He was just caught in between a firefight in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just unfortunate that he was injured by that 50 caliber bullet. And this is no small bullet. He suffered an evisceration. Because of that, he died very painfully. He died shouting and screaming. And etched on his face was the absolute look of horror and terror and pain that I've ever had to see anybody ever had to live with. It's not anything I'm ever going to be able to escape from. And it's the thing that I have to work towards being able to accept every day. I remember when I left Iraq, it was a sense of disbelief that, this wasn't real. When I came back home, I remember there was this feeling of, I got a second lease on life. I have to admit, it took me a while to realize that there was something wrong with me, and I didn't want to see it at first. I'd have these moments too of disconnection of myself, where I would enter into this kind of zombie mode, and I would be a raging storm on the inside, full of emotion of either anxiety or fear or of anger. I remember one day I was just so out of it that I would see that dead Iraqi policeman's face on other people's faces. And I couldn't even look people in the face because I just would see his face on their faces, or it got so bad that I would see their face warped into that dead Iraqi man's police face. And I didn't want to see anybody's face like that, in such pain and terror. And I got scared. Sometimes the harder thing is getting the help that you need. And I couldn't do it on my own. I needed a lot of help, a lot of help. It's almost as if all these infected wounds inside of myself, the ones I couldn't necessarily open myself up and share and show to other people, they needed to be cleaned out. There was a turning point that I was able to clearly recognize within myself that all of the work that I had been doing was worth it. And it was one night when I was sitting down on the couch with my wife and our dog. They were asleep, on top of me. And I was able to look at them and take them in for who they were and what was right in front of me. There was a sense of peace and contentment. The anxiety didn't come in. The guilt didn't come in. The dead Iraqi policeman's face, he didn't even show up. And I was able to smile and be happy. Before, it would trigger 100% of the time guilt. I couldn't help but think that I wasn't deserving of that love, that it was better meant for someone else. But because of therapy, because of my acceptance of what it is that I live with, I'm able to take that in. To be able to drink from that cup and to to kind of bask in that warmth. That's what makes this worth it. That's what makes all the heartache and the time and the trouble worth it.
And we are honored to have Sergio with us here, and also here the Undersecretary for Health at the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, Dr. Sharif El-Nahal. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. And before we start talking, I just want to bring in some information. We have just received the first data on veteran suicide since the COVID pandemic began, and it actually shows a drop in veteran suicides in both 2019 and 2020. And that is noticeable because suicides had reached a peak in 2018. Now, Sergio, with that information in front of us, I just want to say that how much we appreciate how open you are in sharing such a painful and poignant and important story. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how you were trained as a medic to treat physical wounds, but there you were experiencing a wound of a different kind. And was the Veterans Administration there for you when you needed it? Is that where the help began to come from for you?
Yes, they were there for me. They were there for me when I was suicidal, when I was thinking about killing myself, because I thought that was really the only way that I could get away from this. And also when I felt like I deserved to die, that I didn't deserve to have the life that I have currently right now. And for that, I am grateful. And I don't want, to also mention, like, I think with everything, it's work. There's still work that needs to be done. And there's such a demand for therapy right now. So, but I was also to get a lot of help from Wounded Warrior Project, from the Warrior Care Network. They're the ones who really helped me to kind of hone in on a lot of the things that I needed to learn, such as different type of therapy tools, and also be able to process and understand the very traumatic moments that I lived through when I was in Iraq. I have to be honest that I wasn't in the proper place to be able to get that help, because I just didn't necessarily know and understand, especially in the beginning of the 2000s, that I could get this kind of help and that this could be something that would help me to become better. Because at the time when I first initiated therapy, and this is something I've learned firsthand, is that, well, it's going to get much worse before it gets any better. And yeah, it hurt a lot to begin to open up those old wounds and to begin to clear out those, darkened corners with cobwebs all over them. It was just something that just haunted me so much. And I'll admit it now, I walked away from it at the beginning. I walked away from it at the beginning because I thought I could make school my therapy.
So, Dr. El-Nahal, I mean, hearing that testimony, we also have, it really tears at you. At the same time, we have the data that we just shared, that it looks like the rate of suicides among veterans dropped in 2020, but it's still the case that more than 6,000 veterans took their own lives. Do you feel that we're making progress on this?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And Sergio, thank you so much for your service to our country, for defending our freedom, and for the courage you're displaying in sharing your story. I think it's just so important for me and for us at the VA, but also for the whole country to hear these stories, because frankly, this is a debt that we owe you and your colleagues who protected our freedom. And I think I am better for it having heard your story. On the question of whether we've made progress, I think there are encouraging initial signs that that is the case, but make no mistake, it's our view, it's the Biden administration's view, that the goal here is zero. We are not going to be content or satisfied until we reach that point. And that means there's a lot of work ahead. There are some initial encouraging signs with this year's suicide data, but we haven't yet accounted for the full scope of the pandemic and its effects on our veterans, and so we're not hanging our hat on that data. In fact, we have a comprehensive suicide prevention strategy that is only going to require us to invest more resources and more efforts into preventing veteran suicide. And I will say that it is the top clinical priority for the Department of Veterans Affairs, ensuring access to the emergency care available through 988 Press 1, ensuring access to mental health care services in our clinics, including same-day services for veterans who need it, and also community-based interventions and partnerships with organizations that will allow veterans like Sergio to have access to a support network that will ultimately help prevent suicide.
Does the VA have the resources necessary to help everybody who needs help right now? Because we do hear of wait lists, for example, for support in this regard? Where are we in regard to keeping up with the numbers?
Well, I will say that it is a difficult time for healthcare systems across the country in terms of recruiting the right personnel to be able to ensure access to care. And that is always going to be a challenge that we're going to try to stay ahead of. Ensuring that we have the right number of mental health providers, ensuring that we have the full complement of staff needed in every place in the country. And so we continue to make progress on that, but that is going to be a major challenge. I will say writ large that I think we do have the funding and resources to make significant progress. And so we are trying our hardest in every end of that spectrum. And again, we will not be content until we make even more progress.
Sergio, listening to your story, it sounded as though you felt that you were alone, but you're certainly not alone in the sense that there are many fellow veterans out there, you know, men and women. You have a band of brothers and sisters, many of whom perhaps are going through now what you went through. For them not to be alone, what do you want them to hear from you, from your experience?
I think if there's anything that I would like to say to them is that I believe in you. I believe that if you're able to put forth the effort to work on yourself and to find the help that you need, and no, it's not going to be easy. No, it's going to cause a lot of heartache, and you're going to probably cry like you never cried before, but it's going to be worth it. And I know it's going to be worth it because that's what I've been able to find at the end of my tunnel. I found a life worth living. And it was only through the hard work of being able to get through therapy, being able to open up and be vulnerable and speak to my issues, and to be honest with myself and with those I loved, that I was able to even to get here. There was just many times where I just felt like there was nothing but a dead end in front of me, that the only life that I had left was just the one of where I was just going to end up, well, at the end of a noose, wondering if, when my day was going to come, when I was finally going to, have enough courage to finally go through and end my own life, not only for the betterment of myself, but for the betterment of other people. But that's not the truth. The truth is, me leaving this world would have caused many other people much more pain. And that's the thing that I was also failing to recognize, is the fact that I was so connected to these other people, even though I felt so alone. And it's through that recognition of the connection that I have with other people that's also helped me to stay in this world and not to commit that final act of where I was trying to get myself to leave it. So I just wanted to remind them as well that you're not alone. And there's other people who are in pain alongside with you, just like my wife was. And I wasn't able to see that until I got the help that I needed.
Sergio, I want to thank you for doing what you're doing right now and offering hope. And Doctor, I want to thank you for offering encouragement and a sense that maybe it's going to get better. I want to thank both of you for joining us on the program. And coming up next, we have a man who decided to shoot up his high school at the age of 16, only to change his mind at the last minute, and a woman who survived the deadliest mass shooting in modern American history in Las Vegas. The mental health surrounding mass shootings. That's our focus next on America's Breakdown, a national conversation.
I looked at this kid, this last one, and he committed one of the worst possible actions you can ever even contemplate. He shot a whole school of school children. And all I saw when I looked at that story was I saw me 30 years ago.
We are trying to let everybody know how important mental health is, that if we don't have the mental health foundation, the education is not going to take place.
When a gunman who was hell-bent on killing children opened fire inside a Uvalde, Texas elementary school, the wounds of the carnage he created would snowball, especially in regard to mental health. Before he had even pulled the trigger, however, Texas was already struggling, ranked last among all 50 states in the District of Columbia for overall access to mental health care. Advocates have pointed out that Texas could have secured more federal funding by expanding Medicaid, but chose not to do that. And Governor Greg Abbott cut the state's Health and Human Services budget by more than $200 million to fund a border security program. It's been a similar story elsewhere.
Our city was in pain. We were under attack as a city, as a community.
The deadliest mass shooting in modern American history happened in Las Vegas in October 2017. And crimes like that are definitely weighing on American minds. An American Psychological Association survey found that 1/3 of American adults do not attend as many public places and events as they used to because of a fear of mass shooting. When it comes to mass shootings, you know the trend. Schools and places of worship and shopping malls and daycare centers, there is seemingly no place that is safe, no place that is immune. Our next two guests know these facts all too well. At the age of 16, Aaron Stark decided he wanted to shoot up his school until he changed his mind. Also with us, Jen Wilson, who was having a night out in Las Vegas in October 2017 when a gunman fired more than 1,000 rounds on the music festival she was attending. 60 people died. So this is going to be a difficult conversation, I think, to have in a lot of regards, but one of them being your story, Aaron, that you're 43 years old now,
I am.
So we're going back in time to some degree to when you were 16, but you were planning, thinking, dreaming about pulling off a school shooting on your own. What were you thinking?
I was a chaotic and depressed and violent teenager trying to navigate depression without much adult supervision. I grew up in a really chaotic and violent life. My criminal parents were moved 30 or 40 different times. I was a new kid in school, lots of bullying at home and at school. I reached out for help a couple times to social services, and that became some of the most toxic times ever.
In what way?
I called social services on myself because I was self-harming really, really bad, and I thought I was going to die. And when they brought me in, they also brought my mom in, who happened to be one of my biggest abusers in my life. And after we left the social services office and they sent me home with her, and she got them to believe that I was just making it all up and doing it all for attention, she turned to me and said that next time I should do a better job and she'll buy the razor blades. And
wow.
It really, for my early years of life, I would just say I was wearing like a cloak of darkness, like I would wrap it around me like a shield. Like the more toxic I could become, I would keep everybody else away from me that might be harmful.
So thank God you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Why didn't you? How'd you change your mind?
I thought I was completely alone. I thought I was lost. I was like a walking ball of destruction at that time. Just 16 years old. I had already planned out the attack, and as I'm waiting to get the gun, I think now that I was going through a period of saying goodbye. I was giving away my belongings and closing off relationships. And I happened to go to a friend of mine that I thought I had destroyed the whole relationship. I thought I had ruined it all. And he opened the door and saw me and saw that I was a kid in pain and that he brought me inside and sat down, we had a meal, watched a movie, and it was really reestablishing the bottom line of humanity. Like, it wasn't that I sat with a friend and could hang out. It was more that he reminded me that I could enjoy things. Mm-hmm. Like, oh wow, I could like food. Mm-hmm. I had fallen off the cliff of the world in my mind. Like all my personhood had boiled away. Then I was just this walking ball of destruction waiting to explode. And instead, he treated me like it was just a Tuesday.
Wow, thank goodness that happened.
Yeah, he's still my best friend to this day.
Well, I want to bring it to Jen into the conversation. Jen, you were unfortunately in a situation where the shooter did not change his mind. You were surrounded by victims. People were being shot and falling around you. Now you've heard from Aaron that perhaps the shooter didn't care at all about the victims one way or the other. But given what you lived through, did it change who you are?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It changed me to my core. I suffered for the last 5 years with anxiety, PTSD, insomnia, intense startle reflex with loud noises. It's been a long road coming back from that.
You've said to us in prior conversations that everything kind of changed in a moment for you, that it was the fact that it came out of nowhere. And talk about that fact that it was such a surprise, that it was so unexpected, how that impacts the way you're processing this today.
Yeah, I mean, really, we have no control of anything in life, right? I'm learning everything comes as a surprise. But that weekend was amazing from the beginning to Sunday afternoon. And Sunday it was good food and good weather and good friends. And I thought it was going to be the ending to a great weekend. Unfortunately, it turned into a nightmare.
Now, you just said everything...
Without any warning.
You just said we have no control over anything. Which sounds to me that the way that you're processing this is that's the lesson that you learned from that day. Are you sure that you can never, that you'll always believe that, or are you hoping not to?
I think for me, the silver lining is learning that I can't control everything, because prior to the Vegas shooting, I was a big control freak, and I've just learned that nothing I do is going to prepare me for, I mean, especially something like that. But
does that mean that your approach is to take every moment and count your blessings, or is that not how you're experiencing it?
Absolutely. I didn't want to let this tragedy take control over my life anymore. And I guess in that way, I wanted to take a little bit of control back and not be so fearful, live each day like it's my last. I try to be more mindful, more grateful, more present, more kind, because this moment could be my last. And I learned that, and I faced death head on.
You're a mom, am I right about that?
I am. I have 3 children.
Do you talk to them about this, or even do you worry about it?
They know.
Go ahead.
They absolutely know. I mean, I have to say one of the biggest things that got me through that shooting safely was my will to survive for my kids. I knew I had to get home to them. And so when I walked through my door, I was in full-blown tears just hugging them. And my oldest at the time was 6 and didn't quite understand what happened. And I explained it to her that, you know, there was a bad guy at the concert and Mommy almost didn't make it home, but I was so grateful to be there with her. And my twins, they were 2, so they didn't understand then. It has become such a big part of the last 5 years of our lives, though, that they do know what happened.
Aaron, I find it, I'm curious how it sounds to you to hear Jen talk about this, in that you were not thinking about the impact on the victims at all. And researchers have said that people doing the kind of thing that you contemplated doing are actually almost the way you described it, looking for a way to commit suicide. They want to die themselves, but they want to die with, as you said, causing damage. So, given what you went through all of those years ago, how do we stop it? What do we do for individuals who are like you were then?
The best thing I can do is that we can listen. The couple of the biggest recent mass shootings, the Uvalde shooting and then the one in Highland Park, they both really strike me very similar to my own personal story. When you tell yourself you're worthless enough, you believe it. And then you want the whole world to agree with you. And if you can find that one person to remind you that that's not the case. For me, it was having that one friend that saw me as a person. I didn't feel like anything but a walking ball of destruction.
Yeah.
And to him, I was just a kid in pain.
Okay, and Jen, one more point to take away that you're bringing to this story is that the people at the other end of the gun site, they're people. They are not abstractions. They are human beings. I want to thank both of you for talking about this difficult subject in such an honest way. Thank you, Aaron and Jen, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we have a lot still ahead for you, including a powerful conversation between a veteran who overcame PTSD and an undersecretary at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Plus, you are going to hear directly from the Surgeon General of the United States about a new lifeline for millions of Americans. Dr. Vivek Murthy is with us as we continue America's Breakdown, a national conversation.
I, like many people, walked around for years not talking about my own struggles with mental health because I felt ashamed.
You're watching America's Breakdown, a national conversation with John Donvan.
It is truly incredible how much life has changed, how many lives have changed as a result of 3 numbers that you can dial, 988. The federal government and mental health advocates hope it will become as well known as 911, a true lifeline, easy to dial, easy to use, with direct access to someone who can help us in our darkest days. Clayton Sandell goes inside one of the 200 call centers across the country.
The calls here never stop.
Colorado Crisis Line, this is Austin.
At this mental health crisis call center in Denver,
that sounds pretty heavy.
Austin Wagner and fellow counselors are on the front lines in a battle to help people before they reach their breaking point.
It wouldn't be uncommon for me to hear that you might be having some thoughts of suicide, and so I wanted to check in and ask if that was something that you're dealing with today.
in more than 200 centers around the country.
So this is our main call center.
The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline helps people struggling with all kinds of crises.
Losing a loved one, going through a divorce, not having enough gas on the side of the road.
Last year alone, more than 2.5 million people called for help.
It's free, confidential, and available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Reaching the Lifeline always meant dialing or texting this 11-digit number. Now it's getting a lot shorter, 988. Joey Bloomfield volunteers at Dee Dee Hirsch, answering calls once a week.
She said, my daughter's trying to take her life right now.
It gets intense, but he says it's critical every call gets answered.
People just want to talk. They're lonely. They don't have someone they can talk to.
Bloomfield can relate. In his early 20s, he says he started suffering massive depression and barely functioned for 7 years.
One of the darkest days I had was I was supposed to attend father-daughter dance for my daughter in elementary school, and I couldn't do it.
In 2016, he tried to end his life.
I realized when I got better that I needed to give back.
He now channels his struggle every time he answers a call. Helping others, he says, is helping him.
I had a call from a young woman who was struggling mightily, and we talked for quite a while, and at the end she said, "Can I do what you do?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Can I work the hotline?" And I said, "Of course." It was an amazing call.
That is Clayton Sandell reporting there. And now our Amber Strong is with us. And Amber, you've just again spoken with the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy. What's he saying about 988?
He is certainly proud of the work that they've done with 988, but says it's not like flipping on a light switch and that there is a lot of work to do.
Well, Amber, I think it's undeniable that we have a mental health crisis in our country, and it's a crisis that has hit young people particularly hard. And I'm deeply concerned about this, not just as Surgeon General, but as a father myself of 2 young kids. You know, I look at what's happening to young people around our country as I travel to communities across America. And, you know, time after time, they continue to say that they are struggling. And we see that in the numbers as well. We know that even before the pandemic started, that there was a surge in suicides, a 57% increase in the decade prior to the pandemic. And we know that many of our kids, in fact, nearly half of our high school students, are saying they feel persistently sad and hopeless. So the bottom line is, we were struggling before the pandemic. The pandemic has made things worse for many people. And that's why services like 988 are so important, because we need more ways for people to be able to access care when they're in crisis.
You make that call to 988. What happens on the line then?
Well, when you make the call, you get connected to a trained counselor who can understand what you're going through, offer a listening ear, but can also help connect you to resources that can help you both in the moment and potentially for the medium or long term thereafter. And that's really important because, you know, in that moment of crisis, not everyone has somebody they can turn to and talk to. And that's why it's so important that this line exists. But there's something more broader, I think, that's an important lesson from this, which is that if we look at the mental health crisis we have in our country, there are 3 categories of things that we absolutely have to do to address it. We have to expand access to care. And that's not only about 988, it's about making sure we train more mental health professionals, that we use technology to bring mental health care, even virtually, to places which have had a hard time accessing it. Second, we've got to focus on prevention. There are programs that we know work right now, if implemented in schools and in communities, to help reduce the chances that young people in particular will struggle with their mental health in the future. We're not implementing enough of those. And finally, all of us have a role to play in addressing the stigma that is still too often associated with mental illness. There are a lot of people who don't come forward and say, I need help, because they're worried that they'll be looked at as being at fault if they're struggling or not being strong enough. But the truth is that part of the human experience is to have trouble with your mental health from time to time. It's to experience those challenges. And frankly, all of us go through, whether we talk about it or not. So we've got to normalize that. We've got to help people feel that there's no shame in asking for help. And that's why finally, I just want to remind people out there that your ability to just provide a listening ear, a compassionate, sort of friend or a family member for someone to talk to when they're in crisis, that goes a long way. Because when you listen to somebody, when you show up for them, you're telling them that they matter. You're telling them that you're there for them. You're telling them it's okay to ask for help. And that's something that we can all do. in the face of the mental health crisis that we're dealing with.
One thing I so personally appreciate is the fact that you've been so candid about your personal battles with mental illness. Why be so forthcoming about that?
Well, Amber, I think the truth is that I, like many people, walked around for years not talking about my own struggles with mental health because I felt ashamed. And as a kid, I struggled a lot with feeling lonely. I experienced symptoms of, anxiety and depression at times as a child, but I didn't know quite what to make of it. I didn't feel comfortable talking to anybody about it, including my parents. And I suffered a lot in silence. It was only years later, Amber, that I came to realize that many of the kids that I was going to school with were also struggling. It turns out we were all struggling side by side and just didn't know it. And we thought we were the only ones. And that continues through to adulthood as well. The only way we break that stigma, that cycle of silence, that culture, of stigma, is by sharing our stories, by being open about what we're going through. Again, I just think about this as a father. What is more important than the mental health and well-being of our children? And there could be no more important place, I believe, for us to invest in our time and effort.
So that wasn't it. He had a lot more to say, specifically about the lack of therapists that we have across the country. And he also shares his advice for the nation when it comes to mental health and helping our friends out. So we'll have a little bit more of that later on.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks,
Yeah.
Amber. We'll be looking forward to that. Yeah. And also ahead, treating depression. What role do pills play? And what happens to loved ones left behind by suicide? That's when we continue on America's Breakdown, a national conversation.
In my particular case, I had absolutely no clue that's where his mind was. So it's sort of like, what did I miss?
You're watching a special television event, America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here again, John Donvan.
Welcome back, everyone. Our focus is on the millions of Americans who are living with a mental health issue. And overall, suicides are definitely trending in the wrong direction. In 2020, suicides were up 30% from the year 2000. That year, more than 12 million Americans seriously thought about suicide, according to the CDC. Now, Bob Sherwood was a bulldog television reporter, known and loved in his market for his tenacity, until hidden health battles drove him to take his own life. His wife, Deb, was blindsided.
You never know what's going on behind somebody's persona.
Deb Sherwood was a former news anchor alongside her husband, Bob Sherwood.
Whether you're in news or not, but especially in news, because we're taught to, put on that brave face.
Her husband, Bob, passed away 11 years ago. He was an award-winning reporter at TMJ4 in the 70s.
At the Miller Brewing Company, Bob Sherwood, News 4.
Well, I had an amazing marriage. I was married for over 31 years to the same man, but unfortunately he had some medical issues that came up that were not going to get better, and he eventually decided to take his own life. In my particular case, I had absolutely no clue that's where his mind was. So it's sort of like, what did I miss? What could I have said differently? What should I have said differently?
Deb has been working with Mental Health America to spread awareness.
There are things that happen to all of us, financial problems, marital issues, a loss of a loved one, health concerns that, we don't necessarily share with people in general. And being on the air, you share probably even less than most people do, simply because it's so personal.
She hopes her step of vulnerability and sharing her experience will make a difference.
Be willing to admit you don't know it all. Be willing to admit that sometimes we need help. It doesn't have to be help forever, but if you're going through a particularly rough spot, why not reach out and get the assistance of somebody who's trained to help with that kind of a thing.
And we are so fortunate to have Deb here with us. Thanks for joining us, and thank you so much for talking about this aspect of the phenomenon of suicide that often isn't discussed, which is the impact on the loved ones. And you lived through that. And you're also being very open, Deb, about the fact that for a long time after Bob's death, you were not open about how he had died. Was that a mistake? What were you thinking at the time?
It was a mistake as I look back at it, but what happened is that the few people I did let know what actually took place told me, you're going to ruin his professional reputation if you tell people what happened. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I want people to remember him for what he did, not for, this final decision. And I didn't want people judging him or me. So I thought, I've got to take that advice. So I kept it a big secret. It just made everything much, much more difficult.
So what was the turning point for you where you said, I have to tell the world what happened?
I think when you start getting questions about, what really took place. People didn't ask me a lot of questions to start with because he was so sick and people just assumed that it was just a natural death. And, like, why wasn't I coming out of my grief pattern and that type of thing? And it's sort of like, there's so much more to this story than you would have an idea about.
You mentioned in the report that we just saw that you were blindsided by his decision to take his own life.
Yeah.
So that's 11 years ago now. What do you think, you even said you missed it. What do you think you missed?
I really blame myself, to be honest, with what he did. The night before it happened, he needed my help on several different occasions, and I had a full-time job, to go to the next day. So, like on the fourth or fifth time that he needed me to get up and do something for him, I just said, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And he looked at me with such love in his eyes and just said, I know. And we went on with that night. Next day, I came home early because I hadn't been able to communicate with him, and I was concerned, and he was gone.
Well, share with us its impact on your mental health. What did you go through?
I'm still going through it. I'll never get over what happened. You just learn to try to deal with it, and honestly speaking out honestly and completely about what took place
This
helps.
is helping you now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I want other people to realize that it happens in every kind of a family. We didn't have financial issues. We had a great relationship. I mean, we didn't have those kinds of problems, but it can happen to anybody. It's not just somebody who's homeless or unemployed or, had a bad spat with their spouse.
And what kind of help did you get, and for what? You mentioned before that you had PTSD as a result of this.
That's correct. I mean, I relived that moment because he did take his life in our home. I found him, and it was not a pretty scene. So you relive that. I mean, it just doesn't go away, John. It's sort of like a constant. So there are times that, I really literally wake up every night thinking.
Still?
Yeah.
You said something to us earlier about getting rid of the mattress that you shared together. I mean, that's tell that story.
It was huge, and it sounds like such a small thing, but it was sort of like I really needed to change the mattress. We'd had it for a number of years. He had been gone for, almost 11 years now, and I just went, I need to change the mattress. But it was sort of like, this is where we were together. I mean, this is a very intimate part of our life, and it was just an incredibly difficult thing to go through.
Is there a way for people to talk with you about this? If you have friends who do you want them to bring this up in conversation with you?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, if they have any concern about something, I always put it out there. This happened. If somebody has a problem or a concern, I don't know how to solve suicide. If I did, my husband would still be here. But I certainly know what the aftermath is like, and maybe I can help somebody not take that step, or just if they want to talk about somebody that they lost. There are some great groups out there, and the support group probably was the most beneficial thing that I went through.
Deb, thank you so much for shedding light on this piece of it, because we almost never hear it discussed, and you're out there discussing it.
Thank you, John.
It's making
Appreciate
a difference.
it.
Thank you so much. Deb is going to be back with us later this hour to continue this conversation. And also ahead this hour, we asked the Surgeon General of the United States how to know when a friend needs professional help. But up next, questions about when to prescribe antidepressants. This is America's Breakdown, a national conversation.
The choice of going to that child psychologist and then to that child psychiatrist, I didn't realize that would change the course of my entire life. There was never a thought that decision changed my entire life.
This is America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here again, John Donvan.
Back before the pandemic began, back in 2019, 1 in 6 of all American adults had taken prescription medicine for their mental health. In the years following that, mental health experts think the number only grew. So how do psychiatrists know when someone actually needs medication? And also, how do they know when they no longer need medication, when they can stop taking it? We're about to have that conversation with people like Shay Olszewski. Here's her story.
My name is Shay Olszewski. I'm 29 years old. As I grew up, everyone kind of told me that I wouldn't be anything because I wasn't smart enough. So my biggest thing was just proving everyone wrong. And I got really excited when I got this really big producing job in New York at a really big news company. A typical day there when I first started was a 2 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift, which was really hard on me physically. It always felt like you were waking up to just get hit by a bus. That's exactly what your body felt like, which was kind of weird to explain, but anybody who's done a 12-hour shift overnights knows exactly what I'm talking about. Your body never gets used to it. The first killing was Ahmaud Arbery. Hands up, don't shoot! And then unfortunately, we saw Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and it was heartbreaking. As soon as the show would end, I would cry because of how heartbreaking it was. I went downhill from there mentally, just from not having any sleep. And, you know, I was back home with my mom, not in New York with my friends because of COVID. So I kind of felt isolated. I got a last-minute invite for, 3 weeks in advance for a party that I wanted to attend. And so I tried to take off, and I was told no. I was told I had to find my own coverage. But everyone was already working overtime, unfortunately. And just with all of the stress and all the pressure I was under, essentially as a 27-year-old, unfortunately threw a little bit of a tantrum. I've never felt that anger that I've felt before. And I just kind of sat down and I had this realization that I didn't want to do it anymore. So I started writing a suicide note. And I tried to hang myself. And that's where my mom found me, on my bed. I think I found purpose when I was in the hospital, and I found myself helping the other patients more than I was helping myself. And I was doing everything I could to cheer them up, because them being happy made me happy, and knowing that I was able to cheer them up, I decided to go into social work and go back to school and get my master's degree in social work. Look at where I am today, and if I would have succeeded in my suicide attempt, I wouldn't own this beautiful home, and I wouldn't have the newest member to my family, my little puppy Moose. What I found is you're not tired of living, you're just tired of the life that you're living. So don't do it, because it will get better. Even if you don't think it will, trust me, I didn't think it would either, but it does. And it's gonna be hard, but you'll make it through it. If I can, you can. You'll be okay.
And Shay is with us to continue this conversation. And Shay, I just want to say, I am so happy to be able to say you are still with us after seeing what you went through. And I so admire your courage and guts in being out there telling this story. I also want to say, we've worked in the same profession, and people don't really get how stressful it can be to see the things that we see, and the fact that these stories that you covered got to you. I get it. But now the fact that you're out there talking is just amazing. And I wanted to ask you about a certain aspect of the story that you would have experience with. So you left your job, and you, I presume, lost your employer-financed health insurance. So what did that do to your ability to get access to medication?
I'll say it didn't help that I left. It helped me mentally,
being able to leave because I didn't have to, deal with all the stresses and the just all the heartbreak all the time and having to see some of the videos that, we aren't able to put on air for everybody to see. But it's not great. Medication's really expensive. Unfortunately, I take 2 medications I should be taking 2 medications that's prescribed. But unfortunately, I can't because it's way too expensive.
So what does that leave you doing? Just skipping them or spreading them out?
I'm rationing them. So I bought a 3-month supply of my 2 medications that I'm on back in March. So unfortunately, right after my insurance ended, and I was told that 3 months of both medications would cost over $600, and I couldn't afford that. And it was kind of embarrassing for me to be like, oh, never mind, like I can't afford that, I'm sorry. And it's not been great mentally. I've taken a lot of steps back, which stinks.
Yeah.
But
Sorry to hear that.
no, it's okay because I did. It was hard because even trying to find, a therapist is expensive. They charge by the half hour or the hour. And so I did find this like program that if you pay you pay one-time fee, then you get discounted therapists and therapy sessions in your area. And so I tried that out and I did find a therapist. And so I am paying a lot less. It's still expensive. I can't really afford it either, but it's the best that I can do. And
I so appreciate your sharing this reality. As you're sharing your whole story, there's so much there, and you just have a lot of guts. And Shay, thank you so much for joining us and telling your story. It means a lot.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. So there is another side to this conversation. How do doctors know who needs prescriptions, and how do they know how much is needed and for how long? Dr. Sue Varma is a board-certified psychiatrist and a distinguished fellow at the American Psychiatric Association. And Brooke Seam is a 36-year-old who was put on psychiatric drugs beginning at the age of 15 after the death of her father. She wrote about her 15 years on antidepressants and the turmoil of withdrawal in her memoir, May Cause Side Effects. She discussed some of this with her mom.
I didn't have any thought or understanding that the choice of going to that child psychologist and then to that child psychiatrist, I didn't realize that would change the course of my entire life. There was never a thought that decision changed my entire life.
And I can honestly say I didn't know that either. I didn't understand that you would be on these medications forever and ever.
And yeah, I mean, there was never. I think the difficulty with medicating children is that or even teenagers, I mean, it's hard to look at myself as a total child at that time, but obviously I know that I certainly was not a full-fledged adult. But the habits and the things you do at that age become part of who you are as a young adult. I don't recall anyone saying to me in so many words, your brain is broken, therefore you need these pills. But it was said through actions.
Oh, sure.
It was said through the actions of you're not, you say you're not coping well, or we're going to give you something to help you. That implies that you are not strong enough, you are not good enough, you are not whole enough or educated enough, or it just completely implies that you are not enough to go through this incredibly human thing without chemical help. And when you get that message as a 15-year-old, I think it really does a number on your emotional development over the next, for a really long period of time. So it never occurred to me that I didn't need them, the drugs. It never occurred to me that I didn't need antidepressants because I was told I did.
Well, Brooke, watching that, I feel like I'm watching a woman really stand up and say, hear me on this. Did you feel unheard on it for some time?
It wasn't even that I felt unheard. It was that I had been told, again, like I said, through actions, that I needed outside help, and that implied that I was not enough. I didn't have the power within myself to get through the death of my father, and then every single hard experience moving forward. And so it didn't occur to me until I was 30. I mean, I spent my entire 20s and most of my teens on these drugs, and it took a suicide scare and also just, I think, some emotional maturity to realize that something wasn't right.
So was there a moment, a flash moment when you kind of saw this for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, my father died when I was 15, and I had just turned 30, and I kind of realized that I was about to spend more time, a longer portion of my life without him than I had with him. And at the same time, I also realized that means I've spent more than half my life on powerful psychiatric drugs, which wasn't a choice that I ever made. The adults in my life made that for me, and I was contemplating suicide. So I started to put those two things together, and it made me realize I should not be this depressed if my antidepressants are working. So the only choice I had, I felt like at that point, was either go down a suicide path or get off these drugs and figure out what my baseline was. And it wasn't until I started to get off of them that I realized the story I had been told about putting, how easy it was to get on them. It wasn't going to be like that trying to get off them.
So Dr. Varma, our research shows us that more antidepressants were prescribed in the last few months of 2020 as we were at the height of the pandemic. They went up by 6%. And I just want to ask you, is it your sense that this was necessary?
I think it's really important that doctors take a very thorough and comprehensive history, because what's interesting is that a lot of the prescriptions, the antidepressants, the psychiatric medications, are not even written by psychiatrists. So really understanding the medical, psychological, psychosocial factors that are going on in a person's life, and specifically like what experiences, stressors, triggers, traumas that are normal for all of us. Do we need better coping mechanisms? I always say that medications are such an important part of a comprehensive treatment program that also includes therapy, exercise, meditation, yoga, friendship, connection. So I think that medications often are handed out in the primary care doctors, well-intentioned doctors, but only who are very limited with time, and offer a prescription without really taking a thorough history. So I think it's so important that people also see a behavioral health specialist and get a comprehensive evaluation to know, is this something that is normal, everyday stress? All of us during the pandemic, 75 to 80% of people had increased stress, depression, anxiety during great crisis, and that is completely normal. But when you start to show impairment in functioning and have difficulty meeting day-to-day obligations, that is when a comprehensive treatment program where medication is simply one part of it might be necessary.
Thanks very much. And Brooke, talk about withdrawal once you decided to stop. What was that like?
I mean, I had never even heard of antidepressant withdrawal until I started going through it. I had seen a psychiatrist, as we're told to do, and quite frankly, she didn't have any education on the matter at all and gave me really bad advice. And so, we're also looking at a culture and a situation where you can't easily step down on the amount of drugs. So, for example, if you're on 100...
What do you mean by that? Why can't you?
Because the pharmaceutical companies don't offer smaller dosages. So I had to completely stop cold turkey, which plunged me into immediate and very severe antidepressant withdrawal that lasted for almost a year. And that included severe physical symptoms, like all of my senses kind of lit up on fire. I had trouble wearing clothes. I had horrific, violent, intrusive thoughts.
Your skin just didn't want clothes touching them?
It was like it was just so sensitive that everything felt like needles on my skin. And then there's the psychological side effects of severe intrusive thoughts about hurting myself and others. There was rage so severe that I bent a metal ironing board in half. Like, I am a small person and I was able to do that. But it was a reaction to having this drug pulled away too fast. But I was seeing a doctor who didn't know that. And from her perspective, she had no option. Now, we have research now. When I went through this, it was in 2016. We started to have a little bit of research on this in 2019, and now through the pandemic and into 2021, 22, we're starting to actually get an idea of how many people are affected with antidepressant withdrawal, and we're starting to understand that we cannot move medications around, we cannot pull people off them, or at least we should not be, but we are. And so there are so many people suffering from this who end up getting diagnosed with other ailments, other illnesses, that they don't have. They get thrown on other medication. They're thrown in psych hospitals. Like they get sent to the ER. It's a complete tragedy, and one that is probably avoidable with a little bit more education and a little bit of help.
Well, you're out there doing that. But Dr. Varma, I mean, I don't know if the severity of what Brooke says you went through is a surprise to you or not. But whether it is or not, should patients be doing some sort of pushback with doctors who are prescribing these medicines, particularly in the situations you're talking about where it might not be a psychiatrist? Should they be pushing back at the point of prescription?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer in really being as informed and educated as you can on your own, and going in with a list of questions. Specifically, what are the risks of this medication, doc? What are the benefits? What are the alternatives? I always think it's important in the first visit, if I'm ever prescribing medication, after a comprehensive, thorough evaluation, discussing risks, benefits, side effects, alternatives. When we start a medication, it's really important that we also have a discussion to say, what is our goal? What is our endpoint? How will I know this medication is working for me? How will I know when it's time for me to get off? It's interesting because nobody thinks about talking about the end. What is the endpoint? What are the symptoms? How will I know? But I think it's really important to say, listen, for example, this is a first episode of depression. Let's look at all the factors. I literally just had a session with a patient the other day to say, listen, I want to help you get off of this medication. If everything is working, if we've beefed up everything in your life so that you have social support, you've got a regular exercise program, you're meditating, you're doing yoga, you have talk therapy, what can we do to help pull this off? And then you don't just suddenly stop the medication. Under the guidance of a doctor, over the course of X amount of months, you slowly taper while you're being observed.
Again, the two of you have helped shed light on some part of this conversation that we really rarely hear get discussed. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
And up next, the Surgeon General of the United States is coming back with us. How do we know when a friend in need is actually a friend in crisis? And why aren't there enough mental health providers in America?
You're watching America's Breakdown, a national conversation with John Donvan.
Right now, 150 million Americans live in an area considered by the federal government to have a shortage of mental health professionals. We're expecting a shortage of somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 psychiatrists in the next few years. So what can be done to fix that? Our Amber Strong is back with part 2 of her interview with the Surgeon General of the United States. Amber?
Yeah, John, 4 in 10 Americans reported symptoms of anxiety or depression during the pandemic. So I asked Dr. Murphy, what can you do? What lies in your power to fix that?
Well, you're touching on a critical issue, which is the mental health workforce is frankly insufficient right now in our country. It's been insufficient for years, and it's finally high time that we called that out and we started to take action to address it. And I'm grateful that some of that action has already begun. In the Biden administration, there's been a big investment, certainly in the healthcare workforce more broadly. And in the mental health care delivery system. This is very important. But what we've got to also do is recognize that the mental health workforce is more than about psychiatrists and psychologists. It's also about the counselors we have in schools. It's about recognizing the power of peer counseling programs. So the bottom line is there are steps we're taking today, steps we can continue to take to expand the mental health workforce. But this is absolutely critical because it is not right that a child in America has to wait on average 11 years from the time they have symptoms to when they get treatment. That is a reality as of today, but we have to change that. We're taking some steps forward. We've got more we've got to do.
I know you agree that the pandemic made the existing problems worse, but in hindsight, were there ways that we could have prevented people from being totally isolated, especially if we face something like this again as a country?
One of the things that we have needed for a long time, both during and before the pandemic, was a greater recognition of just how powerful the impact of social connection is. We all say perhaps we value relationships. I know I did for many years of my life. But if we actually look at how we live our lives, right, the truth is that for many of us, work and other considerations may actually be more at the center of our lives, maybe more of where we dedicate our time, attention, and energy than our relationships. And so I realized that was true with me as well. And what I needed to do, prompted in part by the pandemic, was reorient my own life and to sort of make people a priority again, to pick up the phone when people called, even if it was just for a few seconds so I could hear their voice, make more of an effort to reach out, to family and friends, even if I just had a few moments, even if it was virtual or if it was in person. And I think that if we had had a stronger network of social connection in our lives, if the social fabric of our country had been more robust, I do think that would have helped us in terms of buffering a lot of the stress and hardship that came with the pandemic. Would it have solved everything? No. We clearly needed other help as well. We needed effective vaccines, we needed treatments, we needed medical care. But it would have certainly worked to buffer the extraordinary stress that came with the pandemic. Finally, I'll just say that is, I think, something that we can work on right now. I think that we're called on to strengthen social connection in our life and in our communities. Strong communities are resilient communities, and they're better able to take on stresses and adversity when they come, whether it's a future pandemic or other forms of challenge that may come in the future.
You mentioned earlier, this is my final question, how there's, we each have the ability to help somebody else. So your advice here could actually save lives. If I have a friend and they tell me that their mental health is struggling, how do I know when it's time to actually refer them to help versus just allowing them to vent? And what should we be doing to better support each other?
Well, this is such an important question because there is a powerful role we can each play in supporting the mental health and well-being of others. Number one, I would say check up on your friends. We too often assume that people are doing okay because it seems like they're happy, all their posts on social media are happy, but you can't tell from the outside how people are doing. The second thing is when people talk, make sure you listen. You know, sometimes we feel so eager to fix that we interrupt folks, we don't let them actually share what's going on. Let people talk. The power of listening is you help people feel seen, heard, understood, and respected. And that is so important. And third, you can encourage people to reach out for help, whether that's to a counselor, whether that's through 988 to the hotline for a mental health crisis, or whether it's to somebody else in their life, including a mental health provider. So many times people may have help available, but they may be too ashamed to ask. So these are simple steps that we can all take to make sure that people in our lives have the support that they need. And finally, just never underestimate how much of a difference you can make. I know from stories that I have heard from patients I've cared for over the years that lives have been saved because family members and friends chose to check in on somebody. So we can all be lifesavers. And at this time when so many people are struggling, I think we're called to take upon that role. And people should be there for us too. And that's part of what this is about, creating a culture of support.
So I think maybe overall the biggest point of his message is that yes, the federal government has a lot to do and that they are working hard to do it. But honestly, the answer starts with us inside of our communities, reaching out to our loved ones and being sort of that bridge to the mental health community.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amber. Yeah. Well, still to come on this hour, final thoughts from some of the most impactful guests we've heard from so far, including Elizabeth Smart. But up next, a conversation about autism. Why are people with the disorder so much more likely to experience a mental health issue?
This is America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here again, John Donvan.
Right now in America, 1 in 44 children is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. A couple of decades ago, that figure was about 1 in every 150 kids. For adults, the total number is about 5 million people with autism. This is an issue I have reported on for some time. It has been my work. In 2017, I was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize along with Karen Zucker for our book on autism called In a Different Key, The Story of Autism. Our documentary of the same name is also premiering on PBS. We are going to talk now about the mental health challenges that face autistic people in particular. And as we have said, that is a lot of people. My guests now are Dr. Barry Prezant, a researcher, a practitioner, an educator, and a scholar with more than 40 years helping autistic people and their families. And Lisa Morgan, a board-certified autism specialist for home. All of this is first-person stuff, as she herself is on the autism spectrum. And Barry, I want to go to you first and clear up one really important thing, as this is a program about mental health, that autism in itself is not a mental illness. It has often been misdescribed that way. Clear that up for us, please.
That is correct. Autism is a developmental disability, a neurodevelopmental disability, but people who are on the autism spectrum are at high risk for having mental health issues. that very often are secondary to a lot of the challenges they face.
So what are some of the mental health issues in particular, Barry, that people on the spectrum face?
I think one of the most common ones is anxiety, and anxiety about so many different things. There's anxiety just about being out in the world, because many autistic people are very sensitive to the sensory experiences. Lights are too bright, sounds are almost in some ways painful, but also social anxiety, knowing how to feel comfortable with people, knowing how to follow a lot of the social rules we all follow in conversing and being with other people.
And Lisa, does this all ring true to you as somebody on the spectrum, this experience of anxiety?
Yes, I live with anxiety every day. And like Barry, like Dr. Prezant said, it's a lot to do with the environment and social interactions.
I think you're saying you're always on guard, you're always on watch, like never able to relax?
Yes. And then after a social interaction, you ruminate about what you might have done wrong, and that's anxiety too, even after the fact.
And Barry, what about depression as a condition that challenges people on the spectrum? Is that common?
Yes, it is. And I always like to point out that we have to go back very early in a person's life as far as the roots of that, because too often kids are given the message that they're getting it wrong. They're breaking the rules and the expectations, for example, in a school classroom. And when you hear that over and over and over again, that you're just not getting it right, it really impacts your self-esteem, your whole sense of who you are in the world.
I know that a lot of kids on the spectrum get bullied in school, and I would think, Barry, that would have to be like a total setup for both anxiety and depression.
Yeah, bullying is unfortunately, despite all the anti-bullying programs and the efforts to reduce that, not only children who are autistic, but autistic adults also are at risk for being bullied by other people because they're so misunderstood. Their reactions are misunderstood, and some of the difficulties they have are misunderstood by others.
Lisa, I just want to point out for viewers that the music that they're hearing is actually in the room that you're in, and it's nothing that we could switch off, so it's not coming from the neighbors. Is there anything that you think, Lisa, that everybody else could be doing to behave toward you and other people on the spectrum in a way that would reduce the instances of anxiety-producing events? Kind of what's your advice to everybody else to get it right?
I think if people could realize that autism is a culture, more and more autistic adults are identifying as autistic. We're using identity-first language. It's a culture, and if people could accept us for who we are as autistic people, I think that would really alleviate a lot of the anxiety and angst in social communication and just daily living.
All right, I want to thank both of you for joining us and shedding some light on this issue. We really, really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
John.
you.
And a quick break, and then we are going to be back with some final thoughts from some of the people we have heard from in this program, including Elizabeth Smart.
You're watching a special television event, America's Breakdown, a national conversation. Here again, John Donvan.
As we near the end of this program of conversation, I want to bring back some of the people that we have heard from. Amber Strong, who interviewed Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy, Deb Sherwood, who is a survivor of suicide loss, and Elizabeth Smart, who survived her own childhood trauma and is now an advocate for children. And also with us, Sergio Alfaro, a veteran who overcame his own PTSD. And what I wanted to talk about is the thing that is the umbrella to everything that we've been talking about throughout this program, which is the fact that we tend not to talk enough about this, that there's still a stigma associated around the challenges to mental health. And Amber, I want to start with you in the conversation you had with Dr. Murthy, because this is something that he is really taking on very publicly, which is being very public about the challenges.
Yeah, he's been called the Surgeon General of mental health because he's been so open about it, not just the challenges we have as a country, but his individual challenges, sharing his bouts with loneliness, writing a book about loneliness, and encouraging us to find community for healing, but also to find community as we shed the stigma, as we talk about some of the struggles that we're going through. And he's leading by example, which I think is just a beautiful thing. And the more you share, I can say from my own experience with anxiety and depression, the more you share with people and say, this is something, not making it a big deal, the more you see them open up and say, me too.
So as you've just made it personal now, do you personally feel that culturally we are getting better at this?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. And it's come from people like Deb and people like Elizabeth, and then just everyday people getting online and saying, I'm going through this, I'm working through this, and you see other people saying, I am too, how are you battling it? Finding community with each other, finding strength in each other. I see it every single day, and I think that we as a society are getting better. But it does come from the top, and it does come from people like the Surgeon General putting his message out there.
And Deb, your take on this must be more interesting, because you shared earlier that when you started speaking publicly about it, you got some pushback that said, do not talk about this. So how do you feel we're doing as a culture?
I think we're getting better. I think that people are starting to open up more, people are listening more. And like Amber pointed out, when you say something like, yeah, I lost my husband to suicide, it's amazing how many people say, I lost an aunt, I lost my father. The list goes on. It's a huge issue, and the more we talk about it, the better chance we have of making a difference. But remember, words matter. Mm-hmm. Use them carefully, and if you don't know if you should say something, don't say it at that moment is my best suggestion. You can always say it later, but you can't take it back.
So you're optimistic, though, on this whole thing?
I truly am optimistic.
Sergio, one question I was not able to ask when we were speaking before is about in the military, where you got to be tough and you got to be strong. Is there room? Is there an invitation to speak about challenges to mental health?
Well, John, I really do believe at the bottom of my heart that there is space for that. But what's difficult is that there's also has to be a balance for compartmentalization as well, because one thing that happens is that when your life is put in danger, you don't necessarily have the time to be able to actually emotionally process right then and there in the heat of the moment, when you need to kind of put these things away and have them put to the side, so to speak. But after that moment, when we have those downtimes, when we have those moments of when we're training, I think what's going to be important is going to be able to, set up our soldiers for success by showing them, by their leadership, who have to take the lead here, and show them that this is something that is acceptable. When you open yourself up, when you're vulnerable and you're willing to kind of share some of those dark thoughts that you may be having, some of the difficulties in your life, and that it doesn't necessarily have to lead you to be ostracized or pushed out of the military, then I think this is something that can not only help themselves, but help them get to a better place. And I saw this as well. I just want to include this coming from the medical side of things, outside of the military, on the civilian side. When I was in medical school, I saw that there was also a push away from talking about mental illness, push away from wanting to even discuss it, because it was almost like we were trying to be superhuman ourselves and trying to treat those patients. And it's just unfortunate, because I think it's something that leads to burnout. That's something that leads to physicians thinking that the final solution is one that's I've seen is common between soldiers and doctors and clinicians, of one of suicide, of one where they think that there is only really the one way out is to kill themselves. And that's just unfortunate. It is not true. But if we don't allow people to have the space that they need to hopefully take care of themselves and get the help that they need from others around them, then we're not going to find much success at all. So
still a lot of room for improvement there.
Oh, yes. But I think like one of the other people had stated was just that there's hope there. I'm optimistic, especially nowadays where we're seeing many more people talk about these things and being open about this. And yeah, I do have hope.
That's great. And Elizabeth, I mean, this whole thing about talking in public, it's become your life. And so maybe you have a better sense than anybody for, are there listeners out there? Are there people who want to hear these stories?
Absolutely. I don't honestly think there's been a time where I have spoken and I haven't been approached by someone who then discloses their own abuse or their own story to me, which then actually inspired me to start the We Believe You movement. And actually, I'm wearing my We Believe You necklace because it's so important for survivors to be believed. And especially in cases of sexual violence, where maybe probably know the person who abused you, and to go out and make yourself vulnerable and share what happened, it can be so terrifying that if someone shuts you down, you might not ever speak about it again, and it can literally destroy you from the inside out. So it is so important for survivors to hear other people sharing their stories, speaking out about what happened, because it helps them understand they are not alone, that they can turn to people for help, that they will be believed, and that they do have a bright future ahead of them.
So what I hear from all of you is that folks who are speaking out are showing great courage in doing so, but we should get to a world where it doesn't take courage.
Yes.
So you have all helped in this program in moving us towards that goal. I want to thank you so much, so very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will be right back. Over the past 2 hours, we have detailed the mental health crisis that is facing America, and we've done it through the eyes of the people living that reality. Within each of us is the power to overcome and the power to help someone else. So be there for each other, listen to each other, and know that help now more than ever is truly just a phone call away with those 3 numbers, 988. My deep thanks to the guests who have joined me this hour and told their stories, and to the reporters, the editors, the photographers, and the producers who have worked for months on this program. And to you for taking the time to watch, for taking the time to care. I'm John Donvan. This has been a special presentation, America's Breakdown, a national conversation.